So today is January 3rd, 2020. And for some reason, I thought that maybe it would be cool to do like a New Year's specific episode of Flashback. And sorry if my voice sounds a little bit raspy. I'm kind of losing it. It's funny, I had these bar coasters made up, and I really like them, except that when you put a hot beverage down on them, it's like enough to do that, and it really annoys me. It's part of the reason I haven't bought more. Anyway, so, I guess in the same way that when Christmas comes around, I maybe get a little bit nostalgic. I still have a tendency to get nostalgic about New Year's as well. And of course, this being New Year's 2020, we've rolled over into a new decade, which for whatever reason still feels like a big deal, even though I'm not sure how big of a deal I think it actually is anymore. And like my earliest memories of New Year's Eve are of going over to my grandparents' house, the same house that I ended up living in with my mom and my grandma later in life. For whatever reason, every year my grandma would host New Year's Eve at her house, and so like I would go there with my mom, and like when my aunt still lived in town, she would go over there too. And like I don't know if this was like a Long Island thing or something, just because that's where I'm not from there, but that's where my family is from. She would go to the store every year, like I guess on New Year's Eve, and just a second, better. And she would buy a whole plate of cold cuts, like sliced turkey and sliced ham and sliced cheese, cold cuts. In fact, that's how I learned the meaning of the term cold cuts, is from her buying that on New Year's Eve, because otherwise she didn't really have like sliced meat in the house. Just because the only sandwiches my grandfather ate were grilled cheese sandwiches that he made himself. He would get like the darkest rye bread he could find, and then the sharpest cheddar cheese he could find. And he had like one of those sandwich presses, countertop electric sandwich presses, and he would make his own grilled cheese sandwiches. And then he had bacon bits, and he would put he'd open it back up and sprinkle those in there. And it's funny because I used to kind of, whenever he'd have one, I would want one, except that as a kid, I hated rye bread, which is funny because I love it now. And probably the cheese was sharper. When you're a kid, you want American cheese, which of course he didn't use. But anyway, he ate that. And so if you went like on a random day in August to my grandparents' house and opened the refrigerator, there wouldn't be like sliced meat in there because nobody ate it. But every year she would get a big platter of that. And then we would drink what I think we called Shirley Temples, which my memory is that it was like seltzer with like cherry syrup in it, which was called grenadine, I think. And then like one like maraschino cherry, like those jarred cherries you can get. And we would just sit around the family room, eating cold cuts and drinking our Shirley Temples. And we would watch Dick Clark's New Year's Rockin' Eve, which so for me, like all growing up, watching Dick Clark was like what you did on New Year's. Like I had no interest even in going out on New Year's when I was a kid, or going over to a friend's house, really, probably, because I just wanted to watch Dick Clark, which is kind of funny just because like my earliest associations with Dick Clark are kind of negative. One time Bithead mentioned on his show that he associates the ending theme music to Pee-wee's Playhouse with Saturday morning cartoons like coming to an end. And so it was always sort of sad for him to hear that music. But for me, I always associated the end of Saturday morning cartoons with American Bandstand coming on. Like once American Bandstand started on whatever channel that was on, that you knew like Saturday morning cartoons were over. And of course, Dick Clark hosted that show. But as far as New Year's Rockin' Eve went, then all of a sudden I was, I loved Dick Clark. And, I remember like those were cool because, they'd have all this live music and whatnot from like bands that were popular at the time. This was, of course, in the 80s, when, maybe pop music was at its peak. I don't really know. And then, of course, you had the iconic ball that would drop. And when I was a little kid, I don't think, like, I didn't understand like time zones. Like, I didn't know that was like a thing, right? And so I didn't realize that what I was watching like wasn't live, right? It was like 3 hours old. And I think maybe as I got older and realized that, maybe when I was like, I don't know, 8 or 9 or 10, I realized, oh, it's like 3 hours ago. It kind of like took some of the shine off of it, but I still watched it. And it's funny because like I remember like, when you're a kid, I think, a year is like a much bigger slice of your life. When you're 10, a year is like 10% of your life, except that you don't remember like the first 3 years of your life. So a year is more than 10% of your life. So it feels like it's a long time. And so like, I would sit there and, it would be like 1987 for like 15 more seconds. And I would feel kind of like bummed out that like, oh, I have to say goodbye to like 1997 and now it's going to be 1988. And now I have to remember to write the 88, on my homework and stuff. But I remember I would almost feel like this weird anxiety as the ball was dropping. I don't know how to explain it or what would cause that. Like, who cares? But somehow I did, like, it was like I was trying to like experience the last literally few seconds of the year before it would tick over to the new year. And then once it did, then, probably I went off to bed pretty quick. And, but yeah, but then like I remember, like I don't remember specifically where I was, only because, usually like when I was a kid, I would spend Christmas with my dad and then New Year's with my mom. So like maybe school got out and then like, in the next couple days, I would usually probably take the train and I would go up to go see my dad, stay there for Christmas. And then a couple days after Christmas, I would take the train back. And, so, I mean, probably my point is that probably, New Year's Eve, 1989, I was probably at my mom's house, I guess. But I don't specifically remember that night, but I remember the feeling, if that makes sense. Because we weren't just saying goodbye to 1989, we were saying goodbye to the 80s. And, I think if you look at like most of the decades of the last century, most of them were iconic for one reason or another, and sometimes for a good reason and sometimes for a bad reason. But I think that at the time, at least by the 80s, I think that people realized that, it was kind of a big deal. Like the 80s was like a thing, And so to see the 80s coming to an end, especially for me, because that was like my childhood, like I was 3 in 1980 and I was 13 in 1990. So like my preteen years were like the 80s, and for that to come to an end was just sort of a bummer, not knowing like what were the 90s going to be like, but to just not be able to even say like, oh, it's the 80s, man, was going to feel really weird, because I think it was kind of part of our identities that we all were just like living in the 80s, but the 90s ended up being okay too. But I don't know if in the 80s, I think we had a different vision of what we thought the future was going to be. And I think a really good indicator of that is like if you watch Back to the Future Part 2, just because, I mean, look, obviously we don't have flying cars and we don't have hoverboards. But if you just kind of look, I think at what, at least what a movie producer or movie writer thought the future might look like in the 80s. It was more like the 80s in the future. And really, I feel like that's not how things have really turned out. But yeah, so anyway, so, the 90s were cool or whatever. Like I said, it was sad to see the 80s go. But I don't really have any strong memories of any of the New Year's Eves in the 90s, with the exception of one. And this is like one of those stories where I'm not really proud of it. Like I'm not going to tell a story that really reflects positively on me, but it's honestly the only New Year's Eve I remember from the 90s. And that was New Year's Eve 97. So like going into 1998. I was hanging out with Fabian at the time, who I talked about in the Christmas episode, and we were gonna go over to like, there was like some girl that he was like into, like trying to go out with or whatever. Like they weren't together, but he wanted them to be. And I think she had a friend or a roommate or something, and so like, you know, basically like we were going over to their apartment, and it was gonna like just be the four of us somehow. And but like I didn't know either of those chicks. But, you know, so like early in the night when we're like, okay, we got to start heading over there, whatever time it was, you know, I don't know, 9 o'clock, who knows? You know, we stopped at like a liquor store because, you know, he wanted to go get whatever it is that she liked. I forgot. Like he knew like, oh yeah, she liked this, or she said to pick this up. You know, I don't know if that was maybe that was a 12-pack of Miller High Life, or, you know, maybe it was like a bottle of Southern Comfort. I really don't remember. But, you know, we stopped and he picked that up. And like at the time, I was not a drinker. So I would have been, well, I wouldn't have been 21 actually now, would I? Yeah, I was still 20 actually at that time. So, well, there you go. But Fabian was like 5 years older than me, something like that. And so I think he was able to buy whatever I wanted. But again, I wasn't really a drinker. So I'm like, I don't even really know what I'm getting. And for whatever reason, what I wanted was a bottle of Hennessy cognac. And not even like with some like Coke to mix it with. I just wanted that, and I was just going to drink that because like somehow I thought it was going to make me like cool, I guess. I don't like, oh, look at how refined I am. I'm drinking cognac, which, you know, you look back on it now and it's like, oh my, that's like you cringe thinking about some of the things you did when you were younger. But at the time, for some reason, I thought like, oh, that'll make me look cool. You know, when instead I should have just gotten a 6-pack of beer or something. But so like we go over to this chick's apartment, and I'm guessing we probably watched Dick Clark. I don't know. Maybe we watched a movie. I don't know. I mean, we were there for hours, and I don't really have that much of a memory of what we were doing over there. But I mean, I was drinking this bottle of cognac. And by the way, it was one of those little bottles, not the little bottle, but you know, they have those bottles of liquor that are kind of shaped like a hip flask. So you can put it in your pocket, I suppose. I don't know how many ounces that is. It feels like it's about 8. But I just got a text from Fabian speaking of that. Whatever it was, that's what I got. And so we go over there and I'm just like drinking that. I mean, hopefully I was drinking it out of a glass and you know, not straight out of the bottle, but who knows. And I don't remember what happened with those girls. Like certainly nothing happened with me and those girls, that's for sure. But I don't know what happened with Fabian either. But the main thing I remember is that at the end of the night we had to go. And, you know, obviously we were both pretty drunk, and this was really far from my house. Like, you know, I didn't live in the hugest city, but it wasn't tiny either. Like if you were at one corner of the city I was living in, it could easily take you 45 minutes or more to get to the other corner. So it wasn't too tiny. But importantly, I didn't have a driver's license yet. I was 20, and so you might be thinking, well, what the heck? You didn't have a driver's license. But like, I didn't have a car. My mom made it clear to me I couldn't drive her car, and I couldn't use her car. She decided I couldn't use her car to get my driver's license. My mom had these weird ideas about how like car insurance worked. Like she thought I wasn't allowed to drive her car because my name wasn't specifically on I don't know. So I didn't have a driver's license because I just didn't need one. I think I had like a DMV ID card so that I could buy cigarettes. And so we're leaving, and like Fabian's like way too drunk to drive, and I'm not sober either. So that's why I'm saying I'm not proud of this story. I drove drunk quite a few times when I was younger. I'm not proud of it at all. You shouldn't do that. Although I will tell you, it makes me very aware of the fact that I'm sure that at any given time there are quite a few people out there driving under the influence, which is sad. But so he clearly couldn't drive. We could not stay at these chicks' apartment. And, you know, I mean, this is before the days of Uber. And even where we lived, I don't even know how we would have called a cab. I guess we could have gotten the phone book out. I don't know. Anyway, Fabian just handed me the car keys and was like, hey, you got to drive. And I was just like, you know, I didn't want to make him drive. And so I just figured, okay, you know, I'll drive. You know, it's not like I didn't know how to drive. And so we drive all the way back to my house, And we drove down the street that's like a really major, throughway street in the city that I lived in, like 6 lanes wide kind of thing. And it's the kind of street you would take to get from one side of town all the way to the other side of town. And man, I just remember it must have been like 1 o'clock in the morning. And we come up to this really busy intersection and I can see all these lights and I see the sign and it says sobriety checkpoint ahead. And when I tell you, people will say like, oh, my heart was thumping out of my chest or my heart was in my throat. Like my heart was like in between my teeth because like there's all these cop cars. Everybody has to stop. I don't have a driver's license and I'm sure I wouldn't pass a breathalyzer test. I mean, that's like you're going to jail. Like that's not like, okay, be safe or oh, just drive straight home. That's like, oh, you're under arrest. And I can't even tell you how freaked out I was. And we pull up to like the front and like they were packing up the show to leave. So like nobody was looking in the cars anymore. That's probably the biggest sense of relief I've ever felt in my life, because I really thought like there's a very good chance of, they might just shine the light in the car and like wave us through, I mean, I was probably already just from adrenaline, I would say, of just having to drive and sort of being anxious about the fact that I knew I was breaking the law the entire time. Maybe that had a little bit of a sobering effect, but that's not to say that if a cop shined a flashlight in my face, he wouldn't still say, oh yeah, you need to get out of the car, And so to be able to get home, I was just so relieved. And it's a shame. That's the only New Year's Eve I really remember from the entire decade of the 90s. And it's not really a positive memory. Although I guess it is in the sense that I didn't get arrested. And then again, like I would say about New Year's of 89, like New Year's of 99, like I don't remember where I was. I just remember sort of the feeling at the time. And it wasn't even so much like, I don't think anybody was really upset that the 90s were coming to an end. Not like the 90s were sucky or anything, but I just think it wasn't the 80s, And, but the things I remember, like people were excited because now it wasn't just a decade ticking over. It wasn't even just a century ticking over. It's like a whole new millennium, right? And everybody was excited about this new millennium. It's the year 2000. But then at the same time, everybody was like scared about like Y2K, right? Like, cause we didn't know what was going to happen. Like, people were half expecting that as soon as the ball dropped and it was 2000, like the lights were all going to go out, or the phones were going to stop working. Or, maybe like the computer system that runs your bank account was going to quit working. I mean, that was the whole premise of the movie Office Space, right? Was that like Peter was working on updating bank software for Y2K. But of course, none of that happened, which was good, And then the 90s were kind of over, but it was just kind of like, yeah, I don't know. It just somehow it didn't seem like a big deal like it did when the 80s came to an end. And, then I was in college, 2001, I moved away and went to university and, never moved back home. And, I don't know, like I kind of lost it. Like when you're in college, like, well, New Year's Eve is like an excuse to drink. And so I'm sure we did that. And, maybe we still watched Dick Clark. I don't remember when like remember Dick Clark ended up having a stroke and, wasn't looking so good. And I think Ryan Seacrest took over. And that was just kind of sad because to me, I just associated like Dick Clark was this person who ushered you into the new year, like every year. And so then once we were seeing him on TV and it's like the guy obviously had a stroke and wasn't looking so good. It was like, it was a bummer. And I think it was probably a big reason of why I quit watching the New Year's show. Like I can't remember the last time I watched one. Not like I don't like Ryan Seacrest or something, but it was just like it's not the Dick Clark show anymore. It's like nobody would blame you if you quit watching the Tonight Show after Johnny retired, right? It was kind of the same thing. But it's funny because like slowly I feel like I've just completely lost interest in New Year's Eve. Like I don't even remember the last time I stayed up until midnight just to like see whatever happened. I feel like now New Year's Eve, I try to take my wife out for a nice dinner somewhere, have a couple drinks, come home, hang out hang out with her, watch TV, watch a movie, and then usually fall asleep, which is exactly what happened this New Year's. We went out for a nice dinner, we came home and we fell asleep. And it's just like, I don't know, it's yeah, I'm older, right? Like I'm 42. It's not like I'm, wanting to party and stuff, but it's also just like, it's just not that big of a deal anymore. Like I don't know how to put this without it sounding like depressing or something, but I just feel like the times that we're living in just feel kind of boring, And like, if you think, like I said earlier, about all these iconic decades of the previous century, it's like when I think of the 2000s or whatever we want to call them, people are calling them the aughts now, which I don't care for that. But like, there's nothing specific where I would say, well, except for, 9/11, unfortunately. There's nothing I really think of and say, oh, well, what are we going to remember about the aughts like 30 years from now? Like, 9/11 and the Iraq War? Like, I don't know, and the same thing about whatever we want to call the decade we just wrapped up, like the teens. Like, maybe it doesn't help because I don't have kids. That's definitely possible, For me, like the years just start kind of running together. But I don't know. I just feel like we're not living in like these iconic times anymore, which is so weird. Because like the technological advancements of the last 20 years are crazy. But at the same time, I almost feel like it's the situation where it's like diminishing returns, like at this point, I don't know what somebody could invent where I would just be like, wow, like blown away, like I remember the first time I saw like the World Wide Web, right? And you're just like, wow, I'm blown away. Or, I mean, like I was talking about a few episodes of Flashback ago. Like I remember the first time I saw Sonic the Hedgehog and was just like, I have to have this. I can't remember the last video game that I saw where I was like blown away and like, oh, I have to go run out and buy whatever that is. I mean, certainly there are games I play, especially like simulation games, like driving games, where I'm still very impressed when I play it. But it's just like the excitement is gone because I feel like we don't see these sort of steps in advancement that make things seem all that cool. Like to me, a PS4 game is not that much more interesting or exciting than a PS3 game, and I'm amazed at how often people are interested in the fact that I don't really play modern games. Like when that kid came here to interview me for that newspaper article, he was really like seemingly like interested in the fact that I just don't play modern games. Like, I don't know if he thought I was like some kind of retro grouch or like I have some kind of personal policy. Like, oh, I don't play modern games. It's not the case. It's like, I'm not excited enough to want to. And it's the same thing with like going to the movies. Like I hardly ever have a movie come out where I'm excited to go see it, or new music or TV shows. And, but it's not, I feel like, I talked about a long time ago on Flashback, sort of about, midlife crises and the generation gap. And I don't feel like it's anything like that. Like just today, actually, I was in an antique store downtown because I went to go eat lunch. And like I overheard the people at the front counter talking about like the younger generation and like, oh, I just don't understand them and their music, and every third word out of their mouths is the F word. And like, that's not me at all. Like, I mean, I work with a bunch of millennials and like, or whatever the generation after millennials are. And like, I think that they're cool. I don't have like some kind of weird issue where like, oh, the music you're listening to is so offensive or anything like that. I just find like pop culture in general these days just to me feels very like sterile and uninteresting. So, because I get people leave comments on my channel sometimes about how like they think I'm stuck in the past. And it's like, I don't really want to be. It's just like, I'm not going to fake excitement about, watching primetime network television. We're going to see most movies that come out now. And I feel like it's for that reason that, yeah, the teens are over. I should be bummed out. That's a decade that's gone. And I'm just not, all right. Sorry about that. My wife came home early and so it was sort of an interruption. I had to go outside and unload rocks for an hour. So, I earned myself a beer anyway. I mean, maybe it's a good thing we got interrupted. I felt, I'm not trying to be all super negative. I just think a lot about, things like the generation gap, just because I wonder, how much of it is, just that maybe as you get older, you start feeling out of touch and left behind. And, how much of it really is that maybe things are getting, I hate to say getting worse, but maybe just getting less interesting or less exciting. So, and I think that probably it's a little bit of both. I mean, someone that grew up, you know, listening to some certain kind of music, you know, if they say that somehow subjectively that music is better than something that came out later, you know, maybe there's a nugget of truth to something like that. I don't know. You know, it was like 80s pop music somehow better than what's out today. I mean, you know, you can go watch YouTube videos of people will, you know, that will break that down for you and somehow try to prove that. I don't really know. I feel like we're getting off topic a little bit anyway. My point was just really that somehow New Year's is like this holiday that I feel like I'm supposed to care about. And somehow it just always is a little bit underwhelming for me, I guess. Like the fact that it's a new year should mean more than it does. The fact that it's a new decade, I mean, shouldn't that be exciting? I mean, I know that, you know, I feel like we arbitrarily have decided that, you know, the 70s had their own identity and then the 80s and the 90s when, you know, really, if, you know, was 1989 that much different than 1991? Probably not, you know, but yeah, you know, I don't know. I'd be curious, you know, to talk to like younger people and you know, get sort of like their thoughts, like people for whom like the aughts and the teens were their formative years, because I feel like they're going to have stronger feelings about that period of time than somebody my age. I really wish I had more to say about, you know, I wish I had more memories to share, I guess, about, you know, memories of cool things that I did on New Year's. And I don't know. I just really don't, you know, I mean, really, I mainly just wanted to talk about Cold Cuts and Dick Clark's New Year's Rockin' Eve. You know, I miss Dick Clark as much as I miss Johnny Carson. Really. I mean, those were iconic guys who are probably never going to be replaced. So I don't know. I guess this was a shorter episode of Flashback. I don't know. It's almost like a flashback mini, I guess, but it wasn't the one I was planning on making next, which, you know, now that I've got this nice setup down in the basement, now I can make flashback episodes more frequently. See, I don't like the way this is bunching up. It makes it look like I have something that I don't have. Damn it. Yeah, anyway, so now that we have the setup down in the basement, which I plan on making a video about, just a brief sort of like tour of like, check out the new setup and just putting it up, for channel supporters. Hopefully this means that, you know, we can get videos out more regularly. So that's going to do it for this episode of CGQ Plus. As always, thanks for watching. See you next time.